Imagine you're standing at a really critical juncture in your academic journey. You're looking ahead at a decision that truly could define your path. For many aspiring researchers, especially, starting graduate school, that moment often comes down to one pivotal question. Who will be my advisor? It's a choice that can feel like trying to navigate this incredibly complex maze. But today we're aiming to cut through some of that confusion. We're doing a deep dive into this very crucial decision. Our insights today, they're drawn from a really powerful NeuroView article by Ben A. Bars, who is a distinguished scientist at Stanford. It's aptly titled How to Pick a Graduate Advisor. Bars offers this much needed roadmap, kind of steering us beyond what he candidly calls the sheer dumb luck that many students end up relying on. So, our mission today is really to give you Bars' essential toolkit to arm you with the critical questions and, the practical tools so you can approach this huge decision with real confidence instead of just crossing your fingers. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that Bears isn't just offering personal tips. He's really highlighting mentorship as absolutely pivotal, not just for your own career success, but actually for driving innovation and, well, the vitality of our universities themselves. He's so convinced of its importance, he even proposes this thing called an M-index to measure mentoring quality, putting it right up there with scientific output. So whether you're just entering grad school or maybe thinking about it, or even if you're mentoring others already, these insights are, I think, universally valuable for understanding what makes a truly successful and supportive scientific environment.
Barr shares this really compelling story about his own path, and it's kind of where he uncovers the first critical blind spot many aspiring scientists fall into. He fulfilled his dream, right? Running a lab, studying glial cells, those incredible support cells in the brain. But what he never imagined as a student was that mentoring students would be, and this is his quote, just as much fun and just as rewarding as doing the experiments himself. He calls it a tremendous privilege. But then he realized there was this huge gap. He looked around and saw that, all the advice books for young scientists focused intently on how to do excellent science.
Right, or technical stuff.
Exactly. But they largely ignored the importance of selecting an excellent mentor. He even admits that he and his Harvard PhD classmates, they basically picked mentors almost randomly, his words, sheer dumb luck. Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you have all these talented students who love science, but some end up demoralized or even leave the field completely, what's the key difference? Bars argues, pretty compellingly, I think, that it's often about selecting a good research mentor.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Bars isn't just thinking about his own success or satisfaction. He sees good mentorship as absolutely foundational to the whole scientific enterprise. It's about enabling the next generation of scientists, fostering their passion and preventing that tragic loss of talent from the research pipeline. We lose too many good people. It's not just about getting the degree, the piece of paper. It's about becoming a successful, confident researcher who can actually contribute meaningfully for decades to come. And this deep conviction leads him to immediately debunk a really common, but he thinks profoundly flawed approach. He says you should never select an advisor solely because they work on the precise, super focused topic you think you're most interested in right now, like maybe something you touched on in an undergraduate lab.
Why is that such a trap, though? It seems intuitive, right? Go where the research you like is happening.
Well, because scientists, at heart, love solving puzzles.
Yeah.
That's the core drive.
Yeah.
And many different puzzles, many different scientific questions can be equally rewarding once you get into them. Bars himself, who studied the brain, glial cells, he provocatively states he'd be just as happy working on the kidney, which is quite a statement.
Wow.
So his advice is your first step should be to cast as broad of a net as possible.
Yeah.
Create a list of potential advisors in your general field of interest and really embrace interdisciplinary areas through those lab rotations. Don't pigeonhole yourself too early based on one narrow fascination.
That's quite a statement. It really challenges that idea that we need to have this laser focus on one specific research area from day one. So if it's not primarily about that ultra specific topic, then what are the truly crucial criteria for picking a good mentor? This is where it gets really interesting.
Right. Bars boils it down to what he calls two critical factors, two distinct, equally vital pillars. Those are scientific ability and mentorship ability. He also adds a third, maybe slightly more intangible, but incredibly important component, a genuine passion for science.
Yeah.
He talks about his own MIT professors, how their sheer enthusiasm just shifted his entire career path.
Okay, two pillars, science and mentorship. Let's tackle the first one.
Okay, pillar one, how to pick an advisor who is a good scientist. And Bars gives us a crucial warning right off the bat here. He says never assume a faculty member is a good scientist just because they have a job at a good university.
That sounds a bit counterintuitive. You'd think getting a job there means they're top-notch.
Well, yes and no. He points out some realities of, the academic hierarchy. Many faculty members you'll meet first are assistant professors. They haven't earned tenure yet. That's basically long-term job security. And frankly, not everyone makes it. Plus, there are other kinds of roles, non-tenure track roles. And yes, sometimes even scientists who aren't, let's say, stellar, manage to get tenure for various reasons.
Yeah.
The point isn't to be cynical, he says, but to be informed. And the good news is, every university has many truly great scientists who are also great mentors. Your job is simply to find one of them.
Okay, so how do you, as maybe a first-year grad student, still kind of figuring out the academic landscape, how do you possibly differentiate the good science from the, well, not so good? What are the actionable steps?
Barr says there are actually some simple, yet really powerful things you can and absolutely should do. First, and maybe most critically, dive into their publications. This is your main window into their actual research output. Head over to PubMed. Think of it like the specialized Google for scientific and medical papers, and look for their research papers. Not just reviews. Reviews summarize a field. They don't show new discoveries.
Right, primary research.
Exactly. And when you read these papers, look for rigor. Is the science carefully done? Are the conclusions actually supported by the data? Are they well-written? Clear. And importantly, check how recent they are. If a potential advisor hasn't published a strong research paper in, say, over 5 years, Bars calls that a serious warning sign. Quantity matters a bit too, but remember to normalize for the size of the lab. A bigger lab should naturally publish more often.
Okay, publications. What else?
Second, you can look at their H-index. Now, this is just a single number, but it gives you a quick snapshot of a scientist's sort of consistent productivity and influence over time. It basically measures how many papers they have that have been cited at least that many times. You can find this on Web of Science, for instance. Just keep in mind, older, more established scientists will naturally have higher H-indexes. They've just had more time. So it's a quick filter, maybe, but not the whole story.
Okay, H-index. Makes sense. What's third?
Third, and this shows real initiative, he says, ask for their curriculum vitae, their CV.
Oh, can you just ask for that? Isn't that awkward?
Barr says, absolutely ask. He thinks it doesn't reflect poorly on you at all. In fact, it shows unusual maturity and that you're being really careful about your future. And on that CV, you can look for certain distinguished awards, things like being a Nobel laureate or elected to the National Academy of Sciences or being an HHMI investigator. That's Howard Hughes Medical Institute, a huge marker of scientific excellence. These are generally excellent signs, obviously. But don't panic if they don't have these specific huge awards. Most really good scientists don't, and it shouldn't be seen as a negative. In fact, here's a really interesting counterintuitive insight Bars highlights. He says a young faculty member who is skilled in the latest techniques, still has a small lab, and therefore much time to mentor you, can often be an excellent choice, even without the long track record or the major awards yet.
That makes sense. They might be hungrier, more hands-on.
Exactly. More accessible, maybe.
Okay. What's the fourth point on checking scientific ability?
Fourth, investigate their grant support. This is absolutely crucial. Why? Because it ensures there is sufficient funds for your research. Research costs money. You can actually check the NIH grant database online. It's report.nih.gov. Unless your potential advisor is brand new, like in their first few years of starting their lab, a lack of NIH support specifically, lacking one or more R-1 grants, that could be a sign that they haven't been productive enough scientifically to merit continued funding.
And an R01 grant isn't just any grant, right? It's sort of the gold standard.
It really is. It's the gold standard of NIH research funding. Getting one means they've secured highly competitive, peer-reviewed support for a substantial research program. That signals stability for their lab and, crucially, stability for your research project during your training years.
Wow, okay. That's a lot of detective work. Publications, H-index, CVs, grants. But it really drives home the point Bars is making, doesn't it? He's not suggesting a casual approach here. He literally says you should carefully research what lab you will train in, at least as thoroughly as you research what cell phone or car to buy, or in his case, he jokes, what espresso machine.
Exactly. He's serious about the due diligence.
What strikes me most here is just how much groundwork Bars suggests we actually do. It's not just about looking at a lab's flashy website or their latest big paper, is it?
Not at all. It's about really digging deeper. You wouldn't buy a house without inspecting the foundations, right?
Mm.
Your academic future, your training, deserves even more scrutiny. Okay, so let's say you've done that homework. You've narrowed down your list of scientifically strong candidates. Now you move to that second critical pillar,
Right, the mentorship ability.
how to pick an advisor who is also a good mentor. Because, as we said, a scientific genius isn't automatically a good guide or supporter.
So what does a good mentor actually do, according to Bars?
Well, he emphasizes that a good mentor does several key things. They help you formulate important, but also tractable, questions. Questions you can actually make progress on. They guide your experiments, help you think through them, and, crucially, they encourage increasing independence over time. They want you to grow into your own scientist. Importantly, they won't put you on a scientifically trivial question. Why? Because your confidence, your development as a scientist, depends on making real, meaningful progress during your thesis years. If you don't feel like you took an important question a significant step forward, you won't have the confidence you need to do it later in your own lab.
That makes sense. It's about building competence and confidence.
Exactly. And good mentors also invest enormous amounts of time just discussing science, how to design experiments, how to interpret data, how to write papers and grants, how to review papers for journals, practicing talks with you, giving career guidance. They also support other activities, like if you want to TA a graduate course or attend conferences. And critically, things like parental leave. Barr strongly believed a few months away for parental leave are, in his words, irrelevant in the lifetime of a typical multi-year project. That shows real support for all trainees, right? Not just seeing them as lab workers.
That sounds like an absolutely ideal scenario, almost too good to be true sometimes. But how can a student, especially one just starting out, really assess someone's mentorship abilities before they commit to joining a lab? What are the practical steps here?
Okay, this is key. The single most important thing you can possibly do, Barr says, is to talk to their trainees, both the current ones and former ones, if you can reach them.
Get the inside scoop.
Precisely. This is your intel goldmine. Ask them direct questions. Does the advisor spend sufficient time with each student? Is there a real team spirit in the lab? Do people help each other out? Or is it more competitive, maybe students pitted against each other? What are lab meetings like? Are they genuine group discussions where everyone chips in and learns? Or is it mostly the faculty member just dictating what the presenters should do next? Helpful suggestions are one thing. Micromanagement is something else entirely. Pay really close attention to the vibe you get from these conversations.
Okay, talk to the people in the lab. What else?
Second, look at the lab composition and size. Bars advises caution with labs that are nearly all postdoctoral fellows.
Why is that?
It might suggest, not always, but it might suggest the lab head doesn't particularly enjoy, or perhaps wishes to minimize, the time spent mentoring graduate students, which often requires more hands-on guidance initially. Also, be a bit wary of unusually large labs, simply because good mentoring takes a lot of time and personal devotion, and that attention can inevitably get diluted in very large groups. Your lab rotation period is absolutely key here. It gives you that first-hand chance to really observe these dynamics. Does the mentor seem completely overwhelmed? Do students seem to get lost in the shuffle?
Right, use the rotation wisely. Okay, point 3.
Third, and this is potentially a treasure trove of information if you can get it, look for the mentor's track record via the trainees list. This is a list that faculty who participate in NIH training grants are actually required to maintain. It basically just enumerates all the graduate students and postdoctoral fellows a faculty member has ever trained, and critically, what job they're doing today.
Wow, that sounds incredibly useful, but how do you get that? You mentioned it might be awkward to ask for directly.
It can be, yeah. Barr suggests that graduate program offices ideally should keep up-to-date copies of these for their faculty. And he strongly believed the NIH should actually make this information publicly accessible online. That would be a game changer. Because when you look at these lists, you often find really widely varying success rates across different mentors. Some might have, say, 70% of their students go on to academic positions, while others might only have 10% or even fewer. Now, not everyone ends up running their own lab, of course. Even the best advisors rarely see more than maybe 50% of their graduates doing that. But a very, very small percentage going on to successful scientific roles, whether in academia, industry, government, writing, whatever, that could be a warning sign that successful mentoring might be lacking. And Barr stresses quality mentoring benefits all kinds of career paths that PhDs go into, not just running a lab.
That makes sense. It's about enabling success broadly defined.
Exactly. And perhaps most profoundly, consider the happiness in the lab. This was huge for Bars. He strongly believed that being in the right lab with a good mentor should feel almost like being in summer camp.
Summer camp? That's a high bar for a PhD program.
It is. But he rejected, completely rejected, the tragic and unfortunately common idea that a real PhD has to involve hating your advisor or being miserable. An advisor's job, he said, is fundamentally to provide a fun and exciting environment and to set an example of enthusiasm and integrity. The rest, the hard work, that comes from the student's heart. He even quotes Henry Ford, "Hire good people and then get the hell out of their way. If things are going well, doing science should feel like play, mostly. And students will choose to work long hours because it's genuinely fun and exciting, not because they're forced to."
That's a really powerful and optimistic vision, summer camp for a PhD. But Bars, he doesn't shy away from the darker side either, does he? He paints a pretty stark picture of what selfish advisors look like. What are those red flags we should watch out for?
Yeah, he's very direct about this. These are signs a prospective advisor might be thinking more about their own career than yours. Things like never mentioning students' names when they give talks, or maybe only in tiny print on the last slide, not taking the time to practice student talks before conferences, pitting two students against each other on the exact same project that creates terrible dynamics, dictating experiments down to the last detail instead of guiding, insisting on writing the papers themselves rather than letting the student take the lead with guidance, letting finished papers sit on their desk for months or even years without submitting them, and maybe refusing to let students take their projects or essential reagents with them when they leave the lab to start their own careers.
Oof, those sound pretty bad.
They are. And Baer states quite starkly that most students who fall victim to these kinds of harmful, selfish practices do not survive in science as a result. It can really derail a promising career.
That's a sobering thought, but so important to be aware of. Okay, so what if, despite your best efforts, you end up in a lab and you realize you're unhappy? What's the advice then? Is it too late?
Absolutely not too late. Burris is very clear on this. He advises that if the day arrives when you wake up and you genuinely don't wish to jump out of bed and go to the lab, it's time to seriously consider switching. His first recommendation is to try having a heart-to-heart chat with your advisor. Give them a chance, explain your concerns, see if things can be resolved. But if they're unsympathetic or dismissive or things don't change, then it's time to move on. He emphasizes that your PhD training is fundamentally about you and your success and development. Switching labs, even if it's after a year or two, often doesn't significantly delay graduation. You can and should view the time in that first lab as just a beneficial, albeit maybe long, rotation. It's an investment in finding the right fit for your long-term success, not some kind of failure.
That's really reassuring advice, I think. It takes the pressure off feeling stuck.
Exactly. And once you are in a great lab, Bars has a couple more pieces of advice. Pick an important question, definitely, but maybe consider going your own way rather than just chasing the trendiest, most competitive topics where everyone else is working. He felt there are hundreds of important topics hardly studied for every trendy one. And crucially, he strongly advises, do not skip your postdoctoral fellowship, no matter how successful your PhD was.
Oh, really? Even if you have great papers, isn't it faster to just get a faculty job?
It might seem faster, but Bars argues it's often short-sighted. Skipping a postdoc, he believed, can mean you fail to broaden your scientific horizons, learn new techniques, work in a different environment. You might not achieve the kind of versatility and fearlessness needed to enter new fields later in your career. It's a potentially large price to pay for skipping what he called a marvelously fun and rewarding final period of training.
Okay, that's a strong case for the postdoc. So let's just quickly recap this mentorship piece. Identifying a good mentor involves those deep dives into their scientific output, publications, grants, all that, yes. But it's equally important to thoroughly investigate their track record of, well, human development.
Exactly. Their capacity to foster independence, to provide genuine support, and critically, to create a truly positive, productive, even fun environment for you.
This brings us to a really thought-provoking point Bars makes towards the end. He talks about the pleasure of scientific discovery being profound, right? But to him, nothing was more mind-blowing than watching one of his own students make the leap to thinking like a real scientist. That developmental piece was huge for him. And he's concerned, he writes, that as competition for funding increases, maybe good mentoring practices are being jeopardized. That pressure could lead to more micromanagement, which stifles that independence young scientists need. So the big question becomes, how do we, as a scientific community, better recognize and maybe reward truly great mentors?
Yeah, this is where he gets quite innovative. Just as the H-index tries to measure a scientist's individual research impact, Bayers proposes this M-index M for mentoring to measure mentoring ability.
An M-index. How would that even work?
His idea was pretty clever. It would simply be the average of the H-indexes of a given scientist's mentees. So you'd look at the average scientific productivity and impact of the people they've trained. He suggested this could potentially be calculated from publicly available data, like PubMed, maybe by including only the first authors of a mentor's papers over time, as they are often the trainees leading the project. It's an attempt, anyway, to quantify something that's often seen as purely qualitative or anecdotal. And for evaluating younger scientists, say for jobs or awards, Bears even suggested looking at the M-indexes of their mentors, based on the idea that great mentors often seem to beget scientists who themselves become great mentors. It's a cycle.
That M-index concept is, yeah, it's brilliant on paper, really trying to create a metric for something so crucial. But I wonder, practically speaking, how much pushback might bars expect on something like that? Would universities or funding agencies truly embrace a metric that might, expose some less than stellar mentoring records? Or do you think a potential for positive change outweighs that resistance?
That's a really valid question, and probably the biggest hurdle. Bars himself acknowledged the need for better studies first, on what great mentorship actually entails scientifically, what practices really work. He draws this analogy to the Gates Foundation's big Measures of Effective Teaching project, which spent years identifying specific practices of great K-12 teachers that correlated with student success. He argues academic science needs to do something similar for mentorship. We need research on mentoring.
So figure out what works first, then measure it.
Exactly. And beyond measurement, he argues universities have an obligation to track trainee experiences confidentially through surveys, exit interviews, things like that, and then actually provide that feedback to mentors. He suspected some mentors might be surprised by the feedback, maybe even grateful for it, and could improve. But he didn't mince words either. If a faculty member routinely takes advantage of students, harasses them, or consistently fails to mentor effectively despite feedback, he believed that privilege to train students should be revoked. Strong words.
Very strong. Taking away the ability to mentor.
Yes. And ultimately, Bars calls for better rewards for great mentors. He suggests considering mentoring quality, not just for tenure and promotions, which sometimes happens, but also maybe for grants, since NIH funding directly supports trainees. And even, he proposes, for the top scientific prizes. He believed doing great science should be necessary but not sufficient for the highest honors. The honor of top prizes, he contends, is actually enhanced by giving them to great scientists who are also great human beings. It's about honoring that commitment to young scientists, treating them generously and fairly alongside the discoveries.
Wow, that really reframes how we think about scientific achievement. Not just the what, but the how and the impact on people. So what does this all mean for you listening as you navigate your own career path, maybe face this decision yourself, or even if you become a mentor, aspiring to those kinds of ideals? Well, today we've really unpacked Ben Barr's incredibly insightful and I think very practical guide on picking a graduate advisor, from casting that broad net initially to rigorously assessing both the science and the mentorship abilities and really understanding those critical red flags. This deep dive shows just how much is truly at stake in this decision. You're now equipped, hopefully, with some concrete steps: checking publications and H-indexes, scrutinizing CVs and grant support, crucially talking to current and former trainees, and understanding what truly supportive, effective mentorship looks like. And remember that key message: your PhD is ultimately about you and your success, your development.
And Barr's vision, it really goes beyond just that individual choice, important as it is. It
Yeah.
challenges the entire scientific community, really, to value and maybe even measure mentorship as much as we currently value discovery. So maybe I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. If we as a community truly believe deep down that quality mentorship really matters and is vital to the sustained success of science, as Bars did, what would fundamentally change? How would we celebrate scientific achievement differently? And how might that shift fundamentally reshape the experience and success of the next generation of researchers? What questions does this raise for you?